let's begin. I'm sure we'll have a few more people join us, but thank you all for joining us today. We are the Sustainability and Environmental Action Committee of the League of Women Voters San Diego and League of Women Voters North County. We're very fortunate to have with us today Phillip Musegaas, Executive Director and Waterkeeper, I love that term, of San Diego Coastkeeper. Philip's favorite way to enjoy the water is up close, swimming and kayaking in the ocean, rivers, you name it. And he wants to see a world where clean water is a fundamental right. The intrinsic value of healthy marine ecosystems is undisputed, and communities are empowered to protect and restore clean water in their own backyards. In addition to being executive director and waterkeeper for San Diego Coastkeeper, Phillip directs Coastkeeper's legal, policy, and advocacy work. Prior to joining Coastkeeper in 2022, Phillip worked with a team of riverkeepers to protect the public's right to clean water on the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers at Potomac Riverkeeper Network. And then prior to working for the Potomac, Phillip worked for 10 years as the legal director at Hudson Riverkeeper in New York. It's so cool. I had never heard of these groups. Phillip has a degree in geography from the University of Washington and a Juris Doctor degree from Pace University Law School. Being no stranger to polluted waters, Coastkeeper is a partner in the Tijuana River Coalition, as is our league. So please mute your microphones and save your questions until the end of the presentation. And Phillip, help us understand a little more about the Tijuana River pollution crisis, which is right in our own backyard.
All right. Thank you so much, Ruth, for you and your colleagues for inviting me to speak today. I'll share my screen in just a sec, but I just really appreciate having this opportunity. Um, Before I launch into the slideshow, just want to highlight how fast moving this situation is. So I've got the most recent updates I could find as of today, but things could change tomorrow. And so I'm glad it's great that that your organization is part of the Tijuana River Coalition because it's a great place to get information. I'm going to talk about I'll mention a few things on our website, the Coastkeeper website, and then also we have a binational website called the One Coastal Community site that we partner with a group in Tijuana, an NGO in Tijuana, and we have an interactive map on there that shows all of our water quality from our water quality testing on both sides of the border. So just some things to follow up on. I can also share any links or answer any questions after the presentation. So let me share my screen and I'll dive right in. And actually, Ruth, I thought I'd try to get the presentation done 30. Does that
Yeah, that's
sound
great.
good? And then we have time for Q&A and discussion.
Perfect.
All right,
Yep.
great. All righty. Just gonna go right here. Let me see. Bring this over here. All right. Whoops. Sorry, bear with me for a sec. Okay, so I'm just gonna work off this one here. Oops. All right. So you can all hear me okay?
Yep, got it.
Great. Excellent. All right. So what I'm going to do today is going to try and give you a little bit of the history and the overview of the Tijuana River crisis. Talk a little bit about the treaty history between the U.S. and Mexico. Um, Explain a little bit about the kind of legal framework. Talk about the current impacts. As many of you probably know, this pollution problem isn't limited to water pollution and beach closures. We now know that it's affecting public health for communities on both sides of the border through air pollution impacts, exposure impacts through air, water, toxic chemicals, you name it. So it's become a multifaceted crisis that I think we're just still figuring out the extent of and the solutions to. Um, So I want to start out by kind of setting the context and the geographic stage. I have a geography background, so I love to look at maps. So this is a map of the Tijuana River watershed, and I think what's valuable about looking at in terms of looking at this is you can really see what a large watershed it is. It extends on our side of the border up well up into the desert mountains, into the Cleveland National Forest. Um, but then the big takeaway, to me at least, is that a big majority of the watershed is in Mexico. About 75% of the Tijuana River watershed is in Mexico. Um, and a huge portion of the watershed is in kind of undeveloped wilderness mountains, right? So there's a lot of headwater areas that have clean water. But the challenge is all those tributaries and rivers you see that end up flowing into the main stem of the Tijuana River, all that water ends up in that little red area which we are close to now, in the Tijuana River estuary. And so, um, again, it's one of the ironies of this crisis is that much of this water, until it gets to the city of Tijuana, is actually fairly clean. You know, it's not perfectly pristine, but it's not impacted by heavy urban pollution until it reaches Tijuana. And then, as we'll talk about, the impacts on the Tijuana River itself, on the Tijuana River estuary, which is a very valuable ecological resource along our coast and literally the coast of North America. And then the impacts potentially to the ocean are pretty severe because you have all that flow coming into this one outlet. And this, of course, as we're going to talk about, makes solutions to this crisis very challenging when you have two federal governments involved in trying to figure this out. Um, just to go over kind of what the challenges are and what some of the reasons for this is. Really, the problem with the water pollution and the resulting air pollution impacts is a pretty straightforward problem. It's essentially that the infrastructure that was built, the wastewater infrastructure. So, I mean, the sewer pipes, the sewage treatment plants, the pump stations, all this kind of, boring and, things that were built decades ago to manage this wastewater flow, uh, were not well maintained, were not well funded, especially in Mexico, but also here in the US. And so what we've had over the past 15 years, and then particularly in the US over the past, and in Mexico over the past 5 years, is if you don't maintain systems like this, they start to fail. And so we see literally collapses of sewer pipelines that lead to, 100 million gallons of sewage going into the river or into the ocean. Um, for a long time, we had a sewage treatment plant in Tijuana, south of Tijuana. That was a key part of the overall system that was virtually not operating. And so all the flow that was being pumped to that plant for treatment was just being diverted onto the beach south of Tijuana and into the ocean. And the sewage treatment plant here in the US, which was supposed to be the kind of the biggest facility to treat the majority of the wastewater, that facility was close to being inoperable as recently as about 3 years ago. And so we just had a system that was neglected and broken down and not functioning. And so the result is massive pollution impacts. Um, the public health impacts that flow from that, uh, I think, many of you are familiar with the fact that because of these discharges into the ocean from different sources, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I've got another map to show you. Um, these flows of polluted water along the coast have led to beach closures of public beaches, primarily in Imperial Beach, for just outrageously long time. So in the Imperial Beach, except for 1 or 2 days here and there, the beach there has been closed to the public for over 4 years now, uh, without let up, without any real breaks and without any real clean periods. Those closures also now are extending up to Silver Strand and Coronado's beaches, right along the famous beach in front of the Hotel Del and those other areas. Those are frequently closed now due to the same pollution. So um, the water impacts are well known. The concern, of course, the primary concern is for the public is you don't want people going in the ocean when there's high levels of sewage because sewage contains high levels of bacteria, pathogens, you know, pollution that can make you sick, essentially. Give you gastrointestinal illness, can give you skin infections if you have an open cut. So that's a concern with water contact. And then, of course, the kind of aerosolization, the fact that a lot of these pollutants, the sewage pollutants, and now we know some of these chemical pollutants that are in the river, when they're picked up and carried through the air column and into communities, then it's affecting people whether they go to the beach or not, whether they expose themselves to the ocean or not. Just simply people who live near the Tijuana River, live near the valley in communities like San Isidro, in Nestor, in Imperial Beach, uh, they're directly affected in their daily lives. And so that's in terms of, what is the most urgent issue relating to this, that public health impact from those these spikes in air pollution, those are the most immediate crisis concerns. Obviously the long-term impacts to our environment and the long-term impacts to public access to our beaches, which to us, for our mission at Coastkeeper, that's a very important issue, making sure that the public has equitable access. Those are all extremely important, and those are all, we're working on those as hard as we can, but addressing the public health impacts and dealing on an interim basis with what's happening to people living in those communities is I think all of our collective priority. In terms of impacts to the estuary and the ocean, uh, you know, I think we know what happens when a lot of sewage bacteria and then pathogens go in the ocean. Luckily, those when they get into a large water body and they're exposed to sunlight, they tend to die off pretty quickly. So, but if you have a steady flow, right? If you have a polluted river flowing into the Pacific Ocean 24/7, you're going to have a constant health impact. The bigger concerns to the estuary into the ocean relate to two things. One is the nutrients that are created or that are part of a sewage discharge. High levels of nutrients in the ocean can cause harmful algal blooms, right? So harmful changes in the water chemistry that can lead to you all may have seen over the past couple of years these big outbreaks of what they call domoic acid poisoning. So if you've seen these stories about um, the SeaWorld, Wildlife Rescue, and other organizations um, treating these very sick sea lions and seals and dolphins and other marine life, that's because of these changes to the water chemistry. So that's made worse. That's exacerbated when you have huge amounts of nutrients coming into the ocean. The other big concern to us, and we don't really know the long-term impacts, is the fact that the Tijuana River also has, uh, through our sampling, we've discovered that it has uh, levels of chemical pollution, industrial chemicals, um, of maybe dozens of different kinds of chemicals from manufacturing facilities in Tijuana that are not filtered out, that are not treated before being discharged into the sewer. And so these industrial chemicals are flowing into the river, being flowing out into the ocean and having honestly an unknown impact on marine life, on the marine protected areas that are offshore. So that's a big concern to us, and that's an area where we as environmentalists really want to see more attention paid, along with, of course, the public health impacts. And then part of this public health, public access, a big part of this, of course, is an environmental justice. It's an environmental crime. It's a crime against people who live in South County. They traditionally just are disproportionately burdened by pollution. And so the fact that they have been dealing with the beach closures for 4+ years, that they are dealing with these sewer gas air pollution for many years now, that prevents them from basically opening their windows at night, prevents their kids who are in elementary schools in San Isidro and Imperial Beach from going outside during recess at certain times of the day because if the weather conditions are right, the sewer gas odors are so bad that the kids can't go outside. Um, we are not seeing these kinds of pollution impacts in North County. We're not seeing this in La Jolla I live in Pacific Beach. We don't see this in Pacific Beach, right? We see it in South County. And if you look at um, the demographics of these different communities, the communities near the border are really severely impacted by this in a way that becomes an environmental justice issue. So I'll keep going. So yes, another map. I hope you're all excited. You all like maps as much as I do. So this is a sort of a little bit of confusing map. I just want to show you this and give you like two takeaways from this map. And one is what this is showing is essentially how this entire system is supposed to be operating and functioning. And essentially, we have wastewater generated in Tijuana, right? Which we have just like we do in San Diego. Um, that wastewater is collected through the Tijuana sewer system. It's again, when the system is supposed to be functioning properly, it's sent to two different treatment locations. So there, one is the International Treatment Plant, that kind of blue square right in the middle there, which is in the US. That's the South Bay Treatment Plant right at the border. That's operated by the International Boundary and Water Commission. And that's IB, you'll hear us talk about IBWC quite a bit. That's who operates that. And then the second plant is down on the left-hand kind of corner is the San Antonio de los Buenos plant, or the SAB plant. That is a much smaller sewage treatment facility that is intended to, whatever the international treatment plant can't treat, then the rest of the flow is supposed to be pumped to this plant south of Tijuana at San Antonio. Um, the problem is there are two problems with that system. So one is the system as it built now isn't big enough to collect and treat all the sewage that's generated in Tijuana. There's just the population has exploded over the past 10 years. There's too many people. Their system, as I mentioned earlier, has not been well maintained. So there's leaks and spills and direct discharges of wastewater. And there is a lot of activity in Tijuana of people migrating to the border, either seeking to cross the border or seeking to get a job in Tijuana, and basically setting up camp or creating dwellings in some of these canyons that are right at the border, where there's no wastewater or water infrastructure at all. And so people just build kind of temporary housing that becomes long-term housing. And without a proper sewage treatment system, their wastewater just goes into these canyons and flows across the border. Um, so it's a capacity question. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a maintenance question. And one thing I do want to highlight from this map, which is this is a little bit outdated, the San Antonio plant that's operated in Mexico, that has actually been rebuilt. Again, this map's a little outdated. So just last year, the federal government of Mexico actually ordered the Mexican army to build a new treatment facility in at San Antonio. They did that in about a year and not quite a year and a half. And that plant is operating now. That plant treats about 18 million gallons a day, which is great. That the problem is they built a new plant with less capacity than the old plant that used to be at that site because they were relying on the US to treat more of the sewage and continue to unfortunately, carry most of the burden of managing this system. Um, so that's again, we can talk about this map all day long. But that's the big takeaways. It's a pretty simple problem. We've been one thing I want, if there's one takeaway I want you all to remember from today, is that this is not a high technology rocket science kind of problem we are trying to fix. We have been treating wastewater and sewage in cities in the United States and all around the world for over 100 years. We know how to do it. The technology is pretty simple. It just takes money and political will. And that's what we have not had here on a collective basis to treat this problem. I worked in New York City for about 11 years. New York City has 9 million people. They have 16 different sewage treatment plants in New York City that treat the majority, that most of the time function really well. And so, if they can do it for a city that size on, three different rivers and a huge area, they can do it here. It's just a lack of attention, a lack of funding, and a political sort of, especially now, a very difficult political situation. Um, all right, keep moving. So this is again, um, you can look at this more later. I'm not going to read through all these things, but what I tried to do here was give you kind of a timeline to look at, and I'll just highlight a few things here, just to give you a sense of how long this problem has been going on and why it's essentially why it hasn't been solved, I think, more quickly. Um, the issue of water flows at the border and in the Tijuana River between the US and Mexico and water supply and all these things, they've been around a long time, right? We're in a desert environment. We've had periods of drought. We're in a long drought now. And so there's always been concern about how this water is managed. Um, the initial IBC back in the late 1800s was more focused on water supply and just jurisdictional boundaries. Um, in the 1940s, the treaty that created the International Boundary and Water Commission was kind of the first key step in what we're dealing with now. Um, and that was established to deal with both border issues and also water pollution issues. Because by the 1940s, San Diego was expanding and developing, Tijuana was becoming a larger city, and those water pollution problems were starting to crop up because we didn't have a treatment plant here in the U.S. to deal with that. So what happened through this treaty process and what's now being carried through the USMCA treaty, which used to be NAFTA, or basically our trade treaty between the US and Mexico. Under the treaty, the US essentially agreed to treat the majority of the sewage generated in Tijuana. I think that fact often gets lost on when people get into this issue and they want to tell Mexico just to deal with their own problems and they want to block the river flow at the border. Um, for whether it's a good decision or not, we made a formal agreement years ago, decades ago, to help manage this wastewater issue at the border. And so all the treatment and the sewage capacity, all these things I'm talking about, all of this is focused on treating sewage only in Tijuana. None of this has to do with treating wastewater in San Diego or anywhere in the US. Um, so they had these treaties. Through this treaty process, they found funding and they built the South Bay treatment plant in the 1990s. That was a huge step forward. And that plant was built to treat about 25 million gallons a day. And you don't need to remember these numbers. It's just that's a small to medium sized treatment plant. Again, when they built it in the 1990s, they built it with the capacity to treat the current population in Tijuana at the time. And so, as time has gone on between let's say the early 2000s and now, the Tijuana population has steadily increased, and that capacity has not kept up. Um, in the late teens, 2018 timeframe, kind of the next big thing that happened, there was there were a series of lawsuits filed against the U.S. IBWC because we were starting to see spikes in pollution, increasing beach closures, uh, you know, increasing accidents in the infrastructure in Mexico and the U.S. And this is after a relatively long period of good operation. So after the plant was built in the late 90s and early 2000s through 2015, the system was operating fairly well. Then we started to see breakdowns and failures. Um, and this litigation that was filed by a variety of U.S. entities against our federal government, IBWC is part of the U.S. State Department, that led to an agreement to get a big tranche of funding, a $300 million to go to expand and repair that South Bay treatment plant in the U.S. Um, Coastkeeper is not involved in that. Our involvement started in 2023, 2024. Um, so after this $300 million was dedicated, there was a sense that, oh, we've solved this problem. We have the money, we're going to build a new treatment plant. Um, what happened in subsequent years in 2023 and 24, and part of what kind of prompted us to get involved in this for the first time, is we learned that the South Bay treatment plant, the US treatment plant that is supposed to be the key piece of this treatment system, had been completely neglected and not maintained, and it was essentially falling apart. Like it was barely, wastewater was coming in untreated. They were barely treating it and they were discharging it into the ocean still completely polluted because they hadn't maintained the plant. And in order to just to get the plant operating at its current small capacity size would take over half of that $300 million would just be needed just to repair it. And so this created I think a lot of controversy and concern. Um, we found out that, we had a lot of work to do just to get back to the baseline, much less expanding treatment to really deal with this increased sewage flow. Um, and then kind of to add insult to injury, from 2023 into 24 and now through to the present, we've seen just an increasing number of collapses of infrastructure. We've seen up until last year, the South Bay treatment plant not operating properly. There's a lot of problems in Mexico. So the problems have just continued to worsen. The pollution continues to worsen. We had a tropical storm in 2024 that almost destroyed the South Bay plant. That was Tropical Storm Hillary. Excuse me. And so we got to this crisis point. And Supervisor Aguirre, obviously people like her, Serge Dedina, people who have been involved a very long time, kind of were really raising alarms about how bad the situation has become again. Um, so I've talked about this a little bit. I'll just kind of go over this briefly. Just shifting now again to the impacts a little bit. Um, the sewer gases I've mentioned a few times. Hydrogen sulfide is kind of the gas that's what happens when a surface water with high levels of untreated human sewage in it. It's that sewage is off-gassing basically and creating this foul odors. It kind of has a very strong sulfur smell. Um, that will, at high enough levels, that will make you sick. That will give you headaches, nausea, um, you just kind of chronic, pretty severe health impacts from that. Um, we have a system now over the past 2 years that the Air Pollution Control District, which is a local agency here in San Diego, they have started doing air monitoring to specifically test for this type of pollution. And they have a website that shows in real time what these hydrogen sulfide levels are. Um, and unfortunately, for much of the time, especially during overnight periods, because of the increases in flow of sewage overnight, those hydrogen sulfide levels will spike and really affect people who are, of course, home and trying to sleep and trying to breathe the air in their communities. There's a lot of work being done by researchers at Scripps and by San Diego State University. Professor Kim Prather and Professor Paula Granados, whom some of you may have heard speak, are doing a lot of research on this. The other concern that comes along with the sewer gases being carried up into the air is concerns about the chemicals that we know are in the river. The question is, are those also being carried up into the air column and being ingested by people living nearby? We don't know the answer to that. I think Dr. Prather is doing research on that, where she's sampling the air column right at some of these locations. Um, I would say it's likely that they are. So at least some of these chemicals are being picked up in the air. And so, again, it just highlights the urgent need to address this pollution crisis. And I have good news on that later. So don't despair. Um, and then just as I talked about exposure to obviously the polluted ocean water, that's why we had the beach closures. No one is swimming in the Tijuana River, of course, but it is a national estuary. It is a wildlife refuge. And the fact that it's this polluted has huge environmental impacts beyond the public health risks. Keep going here. And these photos are the photo down below here on this slide. We'll talk about in a minute. That's the Saturn Boulevard location. This is the spot in the river valley. It's where Saturn Boulevard is the road that basically there's a concrete road that crosses over the river, and the river flows under the road in about four of these large pipes. The problem there is, and the reason this is an air pollution hotspot is because the downstream side of the road, the water flows through and then goes over a drop of about 8 to 10 feet, and so it creates a sort of horrible waterfall effect. So you have all this water flowing under the road, crashing onto these rocks. And that's what creates this air pollution hotspot. It's because the air, the all the pollution in that water, it creates a lot of foam, it creates a lot of aerosolized water that then is carried into the community. Just touch on this briefly. I mentioned a little bit before. The Tijuana River estuary, it's a location. It's kind of a federally and state managed estuarine research area and national wildlife refuge. Uh, this is one of the last, maybe definitely in California, one of the last remaining kind of tidal estuaries and tidal wetland areas in North America and in California. And so that the ecological value of this to marine life, to bird life, to wildlife that lives in these kinds of environments is really invaluable. It's really it's worth preserving and critically important that we preserve for all of these environmental reasons beyond the human impact reasons. And because of the pollution and because of the flows of sediment and other contaminants kind of across through the river channel and through some of these canyons that flow across the border, the estuary is losing its natural function. It's becoming the water quality in the estuary is very poor, and so it doesn't support fish spawning and leopard shark spawning, which traditionally would happen there. Um, and the level of pollution in the vegetation and the sediment are likely affecting bird life. We also have a huge problem with plastic pollution coming through the river channel and into the estuary over time and creating there's kind of a lot of legacy plastic pollution there. So again, as you can imagine, a very heavily impacted area that is very worthy of protection and desperately um, needs protection from this constant pollution impact. Um, Yet another map. This one very, very briefly just want to highlight. So the reason I include this is, as you'll see, this is a map that you see all the different colored squares on the map. I think this is a great way of highlighting the jurisdictional issues, even within the U.S. So this is just looking at the U.S. side of the Tijuana River Valley, Tijuana River Estuary. Um, each color represents a different political jurisdiction. So this area that we are desperately trying to clean up and trying to manage and restore, um, the property in the valley is owned by the Navy. It's owned by the County of San Diego, the City of San Diego, the City of Chula Vista, the federal government, California State Parks, and IBWC. So you have all these different political entities trying and sometimes succeeding, sometimes not, in trying to manage and make decisions about restoring this area. Having these kinds of multiple jurisdictions without a real framework is one of the reasons I think it's taken so long to really address some of these issues. And that's not to say they're not trying. The County of San Diego is really, I think, with the leadership we have at the county board, trying to do a lot to find funding to address the public health impacts, funding to address some of these air pollution impacts, which I'll talk about in a sec. Um, so there's progress being made, but it's just, if we could get these entities to work better together, we could and find funding and do collective funding together, we would make progress more quickly. And that's in addition to the issue of how do we in the US and our federal government work with Mexico more productively to make progress. Just want to highlight what we've been doing. As Ruth mentioned, we are also part of the Tijuana River Coalition, which is a fantastic group. They meet, I think, once a month. Is that right, Ruth? I always forget. And they're really interesting meetings. If you all have time to join them, I would encourage you to. You get this amazing rundown of the political actions, the legislation, community level things that are happening. Um, and we're just a small part of that. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a binational partnership with a group called Proyecto Fronterizo de Educación Ambiental. They're also we call them kind of the Tijuana Waterkeeper. They are part of our Waterkeeper Alliance, so that we partner with them. We've set up a website to share kind of binational information. A lot of the things I'm talking about today are we share on that website. We have a water quality map that you can check out to look at particular locations, and there's a little screenshot of the map there. And you can pull up the data the most recent data, and it will tell you, you can look up which chemicals we've detected, how much bacteria we've detected. If you want to, if you're a water quality nerd and want to get into that. Um, we've been involved in public health surveys in that area to kind of get a sense from the public, both in Tijuana and here in San Diego and in the US. What is how are people perceiving this problem? Many of us are kind of inside the bubble of working on this every day, and we're very familiar with it. But what's the level of understanding and knowledge that the general public has when they think about going to the beach or going to the Tijuana River estuary, and what are their concerns? And we've learned just essentially, people are very concerned about being in contact with the water. People avoid the beach. People have a lot of, I think, a lot of stress and um, concern, and the fact that they can't access their local public beaches. They can't enjoy this beautiful environment because of the pollution impacts. And they are suffering. People certainly who live near the river are suffering these health impacts on a chronic basis. Um, we also do monitoring, as I've alluded to a couple times. So we have funding to do, we sample in 4 locations in the Tijuana River on a monthly basis. We've been doing this for a little over a year now. And we're going to be coming out with a report kind of summarizing all our data probably within a month or so, which I'll happily share with you, Ruth. Um, it's a lot of it's what you would expect, right? We know we're seeing very high levels of sewage, but the issue of these industrial chemicals is really a concern, and what we want to highlight the need to address that in Mexico. And so monitoring will continue. We're probably going to continue till at least through next year. It's always funding dependent, collecting samples like we do, and then in order to make sure we have the most credible data available, we send our samples to a private laboratory to be analyzed. It's very expensive. And so that, we kind of do our best to fundraise year to year. Um, it would be great to get 2 to 3 years of data. Honestly, that's what's really useful for policy advocacy. So we'll see what happens there. But right now, we're doing it every month. Um, we have filed a Clean Water Act lawsuit against the IBWC. That was about almost 2 years ago. And that I do want to talk about for a minute. We feel like that was a very, very successful. It wasn't in the media a lot, but when we filed our lawsuit, the IBWC South Bay treatment plant was barely operating. As I mentioned, it was just essentially passing untreated sewage out into the ocean, because the plant had been so neglected. We filed that lawsuit in April of 2024, and by the end of 2024, IBWC had miraculously found additional funding from the State Department. They had done some emergency repairs. They put a lot of focus and attention on getting the plant running properly. And by the end of that year, they were back in compliance with their permit. So they were no longer violating their permit in the way that we had in basically the basis of our lawsuit. They had addressed that within about a year and a half. Um, and that is, when we filed the lawsuit, they had over 500 permit violations dating back 5 years. Over the past year, they haven't had any violations. So, uh, I really think that our litigation and our legal pressure and political pressure made a difference. And that's one small part of this issue, as I'm sure you can tell. Um, but it's a key part. If we want to make sure that the U.S. part of the system is operating as well as it can, before we go and tell Mexico like, hey, you need to clean up your act. Let's make sure our house is in order before we do that. We also, and I'll try to wrap up here. I think we're close to the end. Um, Coastkeeper also did a very interesting thing over the past year. We worked with an attorney in Mexico, and we filed an international petition under the trade treaty between the U.S. and Mexico. We filed this petition against Mexico. It's called a submission on enforcement matters. And when you get into treaties, they make everything sound very very elaborate and fancy. So essentially, what we filed was a petition or a complaint with the treaty organization, with the kind of commission that kind of tries to make sure that both countries are complying with the treaty terms. And that trade treaty between the US and Mexico has environmental requirements in it, right? It essentially, if you're committing to following the treaty, each country is saying that they will comply with each country's with their own environmental laws to protect these border areas. Mexico, as we know, has not been doing that, right? They, for decades, were just dumping raw sewage into the ocean. They are still discharging about 25 million gallons a day of raw sewage into the ocean south of Tijuana. And so we filed this petition with a long list of allegations of all the federal environmental laws in Mexico that Mexico was violating. We just heard that goes through a process. So this commission, the CEC commission, reviews our petition. They did that and they accepted our petition just about 2 weeks ago. So what this means is now that means that Mexico now has to respond to all of our allegations within 60 days. So by the end of June, they'll have to respond to us. And based on that response, this CEC commission, this treaty commission, can require Mexico to prepare a whole fact-finding report, and the commission will manage this process of basically confirming or highlighting all the ways in which our petition was correct. So essentially creating a very detailed fact-finding report of all the problems in Mexico that are causing a lot of these pollution issues. So, this is not like a lawsuit we could file in the US. We can't force Mexico to do anything, but we felt it was very important to use this process, use this tool to push for more transparency, to force Mexico to respond, and to create a record, a public record of everything that they are failing to do or not doing properly that's exacerbating this pollution problem. So more to come on that. We should know. We should get a response from Mexico by the end of June on that. Um, I can run this through this very quickly. I know we're a little over time. There's been some great developments over the past year. There's been a new agreement between the U.S. and Mexico, or an amendment to this treaty that I've been talking about, that provides kind of accelerated deadlines for Mexico to finish some projects. The U.S. treatment plant, the South Bay treatment plant, on a temporary basis, they have expanded their treatment from 25 to 35 million gallons a day. The real benefit of this is that means they're pulling more water out of the river to treat it with help from Mexico. And so that's lowering the volume of water in the river. And the lower the water in the river is, the less air pollution impacts to our communities we have. And just to give you a sense, about 6 months ago and over the past couple of years, the volume of flow in the river has been 40, 50, 60 million gallons a day, which is very high, especially during dry weather. And that's just mostly wastewater. And so that's creating a huge public health air impacts. Currently, since this additional system went online, that flow is down to about 10 million gallons a day, which is still more than it should be, but that's a huge change. And that will proportionally decreases this kind of constant assault of sewer gases that people are exposed to. Um, some other treaty things are happening. Some more financing is opening up. The other thing I want to make sure and mention is that Saturn Boulevard hotspot that I mentioned earlier. They are There's funding from the county, and there's a process underway. So they're going to basically create a temporary solution. They're going to extend the pipes that go under this road that I was talking about, where this water goes over this waterfall, and they're going to extend these culverts so that the waterfall no longer happens and the water is just carried further downstream. And so we hope that by doing that, that's going to reduce this air pollution sewer gas hotspot, and it's going to help alleviate some of that constant health impact to people living in that area. There's also some interesting state funding coming down the line. SB 54 was a plastic pollution a state law that was passed. That's going to result in $5 billion in funding coming from plastic producers, coming to the state of California. That money will be put into grants by California EPA over the next 10 years. So $500 million a year starting next year. is going to go towards plastic pollution mitigation statewide. That's statewide, but we there was a very interesting meeting last week with California EPA. They want to make sure that some of that money is devoted to border pollution issues because we have a big part of this, all this pollution problems we're talking about. A big portion of that is we have a lot of plastic pollution and debris mixed in with this wastewater and coming across the border. And so there's really some funding that if we use it correctly, we could really help us start to address some of these issues. And then Prop 4 has actually dedicated $46.5 million for border projects. We're working with the Regional Water Board, and we're hoping that most of that money is going to be spent in the Tijuana River Valley over the next probably 2 to 5 years. All right. I have some questions here for discussion. I really can wrap up there. There's just a few photos. This is our sampling team on this slide. Just to give you a sense, when we go out and take samples of the river in the Tijuana River Valley, we wear respirators because the air quality in the water is so bad. And so we don't use volunteers, unlike we do a lot of sampling and volunteer work throughout San Diego, but and we use volunteers everywhere else we sample, but not in the Tijuana River. Um, so I will end there. I appreciate your patience. Sorry, I know I went a little over time. But I would love to, if we have time, love to answer any questions or anything you all have. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do. Well done, Philip. I learn something new every time I hear somebody speak to this. Can you take your stop sharing so I can see who's got questions? But
I sure
let's
can.
start
Yeah.
with Wendy.
Thanks, Ruth and Philip. So I attended one of the presentations a year or so ago by the UCSD professor that's done some of these studies.
Hmm.
And you did reference the industrial pollutants, and one of the points that she made is that many of the companies that are the industrial polluters are maquiladoras, and many of them are in the
Right.
Fortune 500 group.
Hmm.
So my question to you is there action being taken regarding those companies?
That's a fantastic question. So not that I'm aware of. So what has happened? So two things. One is um, there is absolutely a critical need for us to find a way to hold these companies accountable because there's no other source for this industrial pollution. We know it's coming from maquiladoras. There's we've this trade treaty created this industrial zone along the border to allow these companies to operate in Mexico with less environmental regulation, lower labor costs, all these arguments that we've heard for many, many years. Um, and there are good laws on the books in Mexico that say that companies like this need to pre-treat their industrial wastewater, right? In other words, filter out these chemicals before they send their water into the sewer system. Um, those are never enforced, right? So, um, and I think through the USMCA process is that we have on paper under the treaty, we have strong regulations about how these companies are supposed to have environmental checks and other things, but those are not enforced either. So I think it's right now, I think that the kind of the burden is placed on the state and local organizations to try and figure out how to, one, how do we highlight, how do we increase the transparency and actually identify which companies are operating in this area, where they're located. Because if you drive into Tijuana, and I've done this a few times, if we go with a group and look around. When you go into the industrial zones where these maquiladoras are located, many of them they don't have any signage on the building, right? They just they're it's a black box. You don't know what's operating. They have heavy security, barbed wire, razor wire fencing around their facilities. Some don't, Kia and Hyundai and these companies operate there, but we need to shine a light on who is operating, what kinds of pollution they produce. Senator Padilla here in California introduced a bill a couple of years ago, um, which was an attempt to try and address this. He was trying to get a bill that would require U.S. companies that that do business in California and have facilities in Tijuana to basically report what they were producing and discharging. Um, he ran into some constitutional law concerns, which I won't bore you all with, but we need to, we're continuing to work with our legislators here. We need to figure out a way to, at a minimum, to identify who these companies are, because that's the only and China, and whether that leads to a boycott, hey, you're operating in Tijuana, or a law that says, show me that you're treating your wastewater before you discharge it, or we're not going to allow you to do business in California anymore. I think there's a lot we need to do. We are working with a group um, that we're trying to figure out. We're working with a group in Mexico to see if we can actually collect water samples from
Mhm.
some of these right next to some of these facilities to get firsthand data, right? What are they actually discharging? So we're hoping to have that happen later this year. What we would do is get them to collect the samples, and then we would bring them across the border and have the samples analyzed at a US lab. That would be more defensible, essentially. The challenge is we have to make sure that's safe for people in Mexico to do that, because that's potentially pretty dangerous to go into some of these communities and some of these industrial areas to do that. But anyway, I'm going on a long time, but that is, in terms of accountability, that is the worst problem we have, is that, and they're US companies. Essentially, US companies are poisoning people here in San Diego with their operations. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Burl, you're next on my screen. You're muted though.
The Environmental Health Coalition was working on that, I thought.
They are, yeah, they are the group that we're hoping to partner with to collect samples, because they have a good presence in Tijuana.
Mhm.
Um, and we're hoping they can help us collect some data and do these investigations for sure.
Okay, but my question is about the estuary. Why is it closed now?
The
I just looked and Borderfield State Park just opened.
They just
Oh,
reopened, actually. Yeah, yeah.
Reopened.
Um, I think they are open. They have some different restrictions. I think they're open during the week for pedestrians, and over on the weekend you can drive in and now and park again. So they have reopened that. The problem there with the Borderfield State Park was the road, the existing road is basically built in the floodplain, and so every time we've had these severe storms, now dating back a couple of years, the road was essentially unsafe to drive on. So it was sort of a pollution related, but it was really related to just not maintaining a road. So they
yeah,
have,
but that was months ago. I mean, we haven't had rain for quite a while.
right. Well, that's why the road is reopened now. Mhm.
Yeah, but it seems to take too long, is what I'm saying.
It often does, when it's government. Yeah,
It does. There is money to reroute that road, but
there is. Yeah.
I can't remember exactly what happened, but something has waylaid it. Maybe you remember from our last meeting, but but also there's flow even in the dry season because of
Hmm.
the inability for San Antonio de los Buenos to treat its sewage and the overflow to our treatment plant, and then it doesn't, but our treatment plant can't handle it. So
Yeah.
there's, yeah, flow when there shouldn't be. Carol.
Yeah, thank you so much for the maps. To me,
Sure.
cannot understand it unless I really see those detailed maps. Because it's really amazing. Um,
Hmm.
I saw and I heard about the maquiladoras, with this unknown industrial pollution. How would you rate just the sewage problem versus the industrial pollution? I mean, it just seems like their sewage problem is so much worse.
Hmm.
Or
I mean,
I don't know how you think
yeah.
about it.
No, that's a great question. I think in terms of public health impacts, immediate and then even medium term impacts, the bacteria in the sewage problem, and that's the biggest problem. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we got rid of that and we still had some, levels of industrial chemicals in the river, is that going to affect people on a daily basis? No, that's more, honestly, that's probably more of a uh, long-term ecological impact. It would affect people in that area where the river water is getting aerosolized, right? That there's an impact there. But if we address that and we address the sewage, then I think that the chemicals become a different issue. But I guess from our standpoint as environmental advocates, it's like, I've worked on rivers all over the US, that the idea that you have chemicals like toluene, yeah, basically paint thinner and pesticides and these chemicals that some of which have been banned in the US decades ago, that we can detect them in a large surface water river is shocking, because that's just, we assume in the US you would never find that, that's because we have created a system where industrial manufacturers have to remove those kinds of pollutants before it ever gets into the kind of the public sewer system. So, but yeah, I think in answer to your question, the sewer system is the lack of treatment of sewage is the biggest problem, because that's what's causing the beach closures, the health impacts, um, the impacts to the estuary itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Mary Lou, I was hoping you'd have a question.
Yeah, okay. I know this is sort of not based on anything you just said, but we've read in the Times, San Diego, and actually somebody from the Natural History Museum the other night mentioned that Arizona is considering building a wastewater treatment plant for the Tijuana River so that it can sell, or it can, I guess, replace the water from the Colorado River to Mexico, so they can have the Colorado River for themselves. Now, I may not be accurately describing this transaction, but I wondered if you had any information. Is this just in discussion, or is this serious?
I think I think it's in discussion. I don't think it's moved very far, to be honest with you. But we do have agreements with Mexico has agreements with the U.S. to receive a certain portion of Colorado River water for drinking water purposes. So, and because of this current Colorado River crisis, right, that we don't have enough water, we will not have enough water to meet the needs of all the states that are served by the Colorado. Arizona being one of the, pretty low on the totem pole and having some of the worst water shortages. Um, I think there's sort of been this mad scramble to figure out, like, where do we get more water? And okay, should we trade Mexico? Should we get Mexico to give us their water, and in exchange we'll treat, we'll help them with treatment? It's possible, I suppose, but it doesn't, it's probably only part of the solution if they could do that. And I think it's a long shot. There's also a lot of concern about in the US now about well, could we should we meet the Colorado River crisis by just building more desalination plants along the California coast, which we would be vehemently opposed to. I don't know. I don't know how to say how opposed we would be, on a scale of 1 to 10, our opposition would be an 11. Because desalination, we know from the Carlsbad plant that desal is a terrible idea. It's too expensive, it's environmentally damaging, it's energy intensive, all that. But that's, crisis creates, hopefully it creates opportunity, but it can also create another crisis. And I think just speaking of the water supply situation, what we think is that we should invest more and focus on water recycling, both wastewater and stormwater recycling. And so actually taking our wastewater, putting it through multiple levels of treatment, and then using that as drinking water. That's what San Diego is doing with the Pure Water Project. And by next year, I think at the middle of next year, City of San Diego will be producing about 30 million gallons a day of potable water from the wastewater flow. So it's just, that's the future. That's really the only way you can have a sustainable system, right? Just, we're essentially all drinking and using the same water already. It's just, this is a more direct way to do that. And we could do the same thing with stormwater. If you think about, we're talking about having an El Nino year where we may have record they're saying historic levels of rainfall this year. If we could have a way to capture just some of that water and treat it and put it into reservoirs or put it into treatment systems, we could potentially go a long way to solving our water supply. But continuing to draw down the Colorado River is insane. We could do a whole other presentation on that. You think the Tijuana River situation is insane. Wait till you talk about, farmers in the Imperial Valley using all their water rights to grow alfalfa, which they export to Saudi Arabia for their horses. It's
Right.
just it's
And
just
now a new data center wants in on that.
right.
Imperial
Yeah.
Valley. Yeah,
In the Imperial Valley. Yeah.
right.
Sorry. Yeah.
And we'll end up with you, okay?
Okay, thank you very much, Philip, for being with us. And it was just a tremendous presentation. A couple of questions. I'm just curious, you said that nobody was doing maintenance on the American side with that plant, and
Mhm.
why did that go unnoticed for so long? That's question number one. And
Yeah.
then number two, I think this week in the news, Newsom has designated something like 92 million for the border crisis project. I don't know if you've heard of that, but if you could
Mhm.
comment. And then also, why do you think he is so reluctant to declare a state of emergency there? Because it's my understanding that it is because he has not declared that holds up quite a bit of funding coming from other places. Thank you.
Okay, great. Those are three great questions. You might have to remind me of them because but so um, the first question is a great one. If this plant was so poorly run, why did it take so long? That's really a failure of government. And I think of us as environmental advocates as well. I don't think we were, you know, for whatever reason, before my time at Coastkeeper, we were not involved on this issue. I'm not blaming anyone before. It just I think there wasn't maybe that focused attention on, why has the plant been allowed to deteriorate? That's also a huge issue for the Regional Water Quality Control Board, which is the state entity that regulates these plants. They should have, I mean, if they were sending inspectors to this plant, they should have seen years ago that it was like non-functioning. I mean, just to give an example, and I have a photo I could share with Ruth after, but the um, wastewater treatment plants have these huge rectangular tanks that they use to kind of filter and aerate the sewage. They just look like enormous rectangular, like concrete tanks, and they're out in the open air. And they're supposed to be, when you see a functioning plant, they're supposed to be full of water. You shouldn't be able to see things in them. At the South Bay treatment plant 2 years ago, those those tanks were full of sediment all the way to the top, and they had not been cleaned out for so long that there were trees and like vegetation. It was like, and they would joke about it. I was like, oh, we have tomato
I
plants
think I've
growing,
seen some of those
right?
photos
Yeah,
actually.
it was like, are you kidding me? So I think it was a failure across the board. And if you asked IBWC, they would say, well, we're a very poor agency. We rely on funding from the State Department, and it's very difficult to get it, and blah blah blah. But they didn't raise the alarm either. And how do you operate a system like that? I think they're an incompetent agency, or they have been in the past. They're better now, I would say, in fairness, because of all the negative attention that's been focused on them. So we're moving in a better direction. There's more funding coming in, but we really are going to have to be watchdogs to make sure they use the funding properly and they maintain the plan. Because if they don't, in 15 years, we'll be back in the same situation. So that's question one. Question two, about the 46 million. So Governor Newsom announced, I think that there was all this state funding going to Tijuana River. My understanding is 46.5 million was the news that I saw. Um, but per Governor Newsom, he's very politically savvy. So he was essentially announcing this Prop 4 funding that I mentioned kind of taking credit for something that was done through ballot measure 2 years ago. So, he's a politician. He's like, hey, this is great. I found new funding. It's like, well, no, you didn't. The people voted on this proposition. It's a bond
right.
proposition, right?
Yeah, no, no.
And the funding is in now, and that's the state water board, which oversees all these things statewide, has set up a process to disperse that money. So ideally, there's a list of projects that was developed locally by the regional board here that's been sent to the Sacramento. So we have a really good list of projects that hopefully will get funded using some of that money. So that's a great step forward.
Yeah.
Wasn't really Newsom that got that done, but we'll take it. And then remind me your last question. Sorry.
Oh, it's why he doesn't want to declare a
Yeah.
state of emergency.
I think, he's made a lot of kind of, wonky legal arguments about why this particular issue didn't qualify under state law and federal law. I think it's optics. I mean, maybe this is me personally speaking, but Governor Newsom aspires to higher office, and I think he doesn't want his name connected to any issue that maybe isn't going to work out well. And this is not an easy issue to fix. So I think he's just avoiding it because he doesn't want to be he'd rather take the criticism for not doing anything than doing something that may not solve the problem. That's my sense. I don't know. I mean, there's not a good legal reason. He could declare an emergency. He could also, the other thing he has continually failed to do, he could call President Trump or something to that effect. He could have someone else called the president. He could make a formal request to the president to declare a federal emergency. Now, the federal government's response would be, well, you need to declare a state emergency first, and then we will do it. So it's this chicken or egg thing that they pass back and forth. But if we got a federal disaster declaration, there would be streamlined permitting and funding. Again, it's not a silver bullet, but it would help speed things up. It would have gotten funding to fix this Saturn Boulevard location. It could have gotten funding for air filters, for air purifiers for people living in that area. We're dealing with these problems now locally and more slowly, but that would have helped a lot. He won't do it. I could ask you all to sign that petition that we have going around, it'd be great if you did, but Newsom is on his way out. He's not gonna do it. So
Well, we
Well,
know. I was
think-
just wondering,
Yeah.
then because he declared it for Pacific Palisades, and
Right.
so it's like, okay. Anyway,
Well-
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at who lives in Pacific Palisades and who lives in San Isidro, and you have your answer.
Okay. Oh goodness, I wouldn't have thought of that. Thank you.
Phillip, thank you so much. I think we could do a whole nother session on this.
I know, I'm sorry I went over time, but
so much
yeah.
to talk about, and
Yeah.
so interesting and ongoing. But thank you to you and Coastkeeper for keeping it front and center, and your participation in the coalition, and
You're very welcome.
appreciate it.
Yeah, we're making progress.
Yeah, poco a poco.
Let's keep the pressure on and keep organizing, and we're gonna move forward. So
Little by little.
thank you all.
Thank
Yeah,
you so
all right.
much.
Have a great night. Thanks
Okay,
for
good.
bearing with me.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Posey
Bye-bye.
or